This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Play? Ron? We're recording?
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi Sai. Okay, so last week we discussed a very interesting inyan, a little bit of a topic which is not for a general audience, if you remember. The Gemara made an astounding statement. The Gemara said on Daf Yigimel Vez that first of all, Esther, while she lived with Achashverosh, she showed her maros dam to the Chachamim. And then the Gemara said, Amar Rabba bar Lema, Shahoisa oimedes mecheiko shel Achashverosh v'toivelas v'yosheves b'cheiko shel Mordechai. She got out of literally the lap of Achashverosh. She went to the mikvah, and she went to Mordechai. She went to the lap of Mordechai. She lived with Achashverosh. She was toivel, and then she went to Mordechai. Rashi says, what's she toivel for? What's she toivel for? Living with a guy doesn't make you tamei. A nida is tamei. Living with a guy doesn't make you tamei. Rashi says it was just out nakios, out of cleanliness, because she would be like disgusting to the tzaddik. The tzaddik would not want to live with her after Achashverosh lived with her. Okay, so if you remember, we began last year. I'm going to give you a 5-minute executive summary and then get you right into where we're holding. Tosfos had the following question. Tosfos asked, how could she go live with Achashverosh, then immediately go live with Mordechai? There's a halacha that you need havchana. Havchana means that, let's say a woman is married, and then she gets divorced or her husband dies, she can't get remarried for another 3 months. Otherwise, we're not going to know who the child's father is, right? You need a 3-month window to be able to determine clearly, is the father the first guy, is the father the second guy. So if even when there's a divorce or there's a death, the halacha is you need to wait 3 months, so then how could she get out of Achashverosh's lap and go directly to Mordechai? And Tosfos answered the following. Shahoisa mishameshes b'moich. She had relations with a moich. Literally, the translation of moich is a contraceptive. Mamela, we know exactly who the father is because when she lived with one of them, she used the moich. And if you remember, the question is, with whom did she use the moich? And we spoke out, the Maharsha said, she never would have used the moich with Mordechai. Mordechai's a tzaddik. He's not going to have relations using a moich. So she must have used the moich with Achashverosh. Mamela, if you remember, we started off the shir last week. There was a stira between Rashi in the beginning of Divrei Hayamim and Rashi in the beginning of Ezra. Rashi in the beginning of Ezra says Daryavesh was the son of Achashverosh and Mordechai. Achashverosh and Esther. Rashi in the beginning of Divrei Hayamim says Daryavesh is the son of Mordechai and Esther. It's a little bit of a contradiction. But okay, let's just back to Tosfos. Tosfos says she was mishameshes b'moich, and the Maharsha says she must have been mishameshes b'moich with Achashverosh. So comes Rabbi Yonasan, and this is where we start today. And he says, let's think for a moment. If she was mishameshes b'moich when she lived with Achashverosh, then Daryavesh, says Rabbi Yonasan, could not have been born until much later when she became Aser to Mordechai, and now she doesn't need to be mishameshes b'moich with Achashverosh anymore. In other words, why is she mishameshes b'moich? Because of the Isser of Havchana. Havchana says we need to know who the father is. So Kozman, that she's living with Mordechai, she had to use a moich when she was living with Achashverosh. But later on in the story, when she goes to Achashverosh B'Ratzain, and she says V'chashar avadati, then she needs to be mishameshes. Then she doesn't need to be mishameshes b'moich with Mordechai anymore because she's not living with Mordechai. Mamela, Daryavesh must have been the son of Achashverosh later on in the story. In other words, in the beginning of the story, Daryavesh could not have been Achashverosh's son. Why? Because they were using a moich. It must have been only later on in the story. Comes Rabbi Yonasan. He says, what's Tabichlal? Tosfos is kasha, that you have to wait 3 months because of Havchana. There's a machlokes. Is the Isser of Havchana an Isser d'Oraisa or an Isser d'Rabbanan? If it's an Isser d'Rabbanan, in the times of Mordechai, there were no Isurei d'Rabbanan yet. The Isurei d'Rabbanan were later on, the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. It must be Tosfos is in the Manda Amar that Havchana is d'Oraisa. So the Maharsha says, who is she using the moich with? With Achashverosh. Im Kain, Maharsha, the Rabbi Yonasan makes a cheshbon. If so, she only became pregnant from Achashverosh in the 12th year of his reign. right? Like it says in the Megillah, in the 12th year of his reign was the Purim story, and that's when she went in Baratzon. If that's the case, that means Daryavesh must have been born in the 13th year of Achashverosh's reign. Guess how old Daryavesh was when they built the Beis HaMikdash? 2 years old. Can't be. Can't be. He could not have been 2 years old and giving authority and authorize the construction of Beis HaMikdash as a 2-year-old. I know there are a lot of precocious 2-year-olds, but not like that. Says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, Umarsha loy dak b'kan. The Marsha obviously did not do his due diligence in analyzing the sugya, because according to him, that she was mishameshes b'moich with Achashverosh, that means she could not have had a child until the 13th year. That would make Daryavesh 2 years old.
Esther could have been the regent.
The what?
The regent.
What is that? What do you mean?
He was a minor, so she was essentially in control, although he was the titular king. And it would make great sense.
Okay. Still, to have a king as a 2-year-old sounds a little bit far-fetched, right? So, I think, if you remember from last week's shir,
Daryavesh or Perish?
Daryavesh. If you remember from last week's shir, we said from the Tosas Harash that Daryavesh was really the son of Esther and Mordechai. Why is Daryavesh called the son of Achashverosh? Because he raised him. In other words, you say it like this. According to the Marsha, Daryavesh was not born from Esther and Achashverosh in the 13th year of his reign. Daryavesh was born from Mordechai and Esther, and she was not Mishameshes b'moich with Mordechai. Why is Daryavesh called the son of Achashverosh? He just paid for his tuition, that's all. Im Kain, that's what, and the Tosar Rosh says that Daryavesh was Mordechai's son. So if anything, the Marsha was duck very well. The Marsha learned the sugya very well. He just holds like the Tosar Rosh. Now it could be, what is important to know, the Achronim never saw the Tosar Rosh. Tosar Rosh was discovered in this century. For 1,000 years, nobody had the Tosar Rosh. The manuscripts were discovered recently. The Mela, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz perhaps did not know this possibility, that Daryavesh was the son of Mordechai. Okay. Now, we spoke out from the Torah Yevon, from the Shagas Aryeh. She was Mishameshes b'moich b'Mordechai, and therefore Daryavesh could have been born in the beginning of his reign. Okay, this is where we pick up, okay? New stuff.
This means that the Achashverosh, Mordechai and Esther were married. They were living together. What do you mean? Yeah, of course.
He
just took her as a...
No, lakach loy lavas, al tikri labas, el labayis. Yeah, they were husband and wife. They were husband and wife. No.
But it still makes him 7, 8 years old?
That would make him 12, 13 years old, which is much more possible than being 2 years old. Okay, let's pick it up. Now I want to tell you over a couple new Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitzes. Okay. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz has the following kasha. According to Tosfos wants to know, then how could Esther get up out of Achashverosh and go straight to Mordechai, right? You need havchana. B'chlal, ask Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, the halacha is, these were years of tzara for Klal Yisrael, right? You're not to be mishamesh be'beis tzara. Right? We learned from Yosef. Yosef did not have any children in Mitzrayim. Right? So how was Esther allowed to live with Mordechai at this time? It was an Eitz Tzara, Tashmish is Aser.
Is there for everyone or for her?
For Klal Yisrael. So Mamela, I get how she could live with Achashverosh. She had no choice. But what's Mordechai doing? What's Mordechai doing?
Sorry.
So he says like this. Be'ez tzara, it's mutter leil tefillah. Leil tefillah, the ikar mitzvah, the mitzvah d'oraisa, the mitzvah oina is mutter. So 1 second. That means she's only living with Mordechai leil tefillah. That means before leil tefillah, obviously she was a nida. If she's a nida, she obviously is not pregnant. If she's not pregnant, there's no reason to have Isra Havchana. In other words, Mordechai, the Isra Havchana is, you can't marry a woman, because under normal circumstances, Leil Tefillah is not the only time. But here it's an Eitz Tzara, so it's Eitz Tzara B'chlal Tashmish Azansa. It's only mutter when Leil Tefillah. Leil Tefillah, there's no problem of Havchana, because if a woman's a Nida, she obviously is not carrying a child. Can't be a Nida and carry a child. She's not having her cycle when she's carrying. So that's how Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz answers Tosfos' kasha. Okay, now we move into a completely new aspect of the sugya, and that is something that is brought down. Now Rizal writes this in the Eitz Chaim, Pri Eitz Chaim, and the Zohar HaKadosh in Parshas Ki Seitzei. The Zohar HaKadosh asks the following question: How in the world could Achashverosh have the zchus to be mizdabek to a tzaddikus like Esther? I mean, that's very unusual. Here you have the most garaba mensch in the world. The Gemara says he's like a bear. He eats like a bear. He had basar like a bear. And a guy like him, he's living with Esther. Says the Zohar the following. He never lived with her. Esther had a shade, a lookalike. She cloned, or maybe she had a demon that she would send to Achashverosh, and that demon took her place. And Achashverosh never had relations with Esther. That's what the Zohar writes. In fact, so you say, okay, well, is that Merumas in the Gemara? L'chayra it is. The Gemara says earlier on Daf Yud Gimel, the Gemara says like this. Amar Rava, she had 7 maidservants with which she would count the days of the week. What did she eat? Pasuk says, Vayishaneha v'yasna roiseha. They gave her different food. Amar Rav, shehachila machal Yehudi. They fed her kosher food. Okay, they ordered from her holy schnitzel, right? Ushmuel Amar, shehachila kidli de chaziri. They fed her fatty hog bacon. So now the shadow, did she eat it? Tosa says, Kali the Chazir, V'chas v'shalom, hi loy hoysa oichelet. She never ate it. So they ordered her fatty hog bacon. Say that 10 times fast, right? Kadli the Chaziri, but she didn't eat it. Tosa says she didn't eat it. So what happened to the food? Ulai, and Rabbi Yonasan Abishat says this. She never ate it. The shade ate it. Rashi said she did it. Rashi says she did eat it. Rashi says she ate it, but what could she do? Her life is on the line. She ate the fatty hog bacon. But Toys said she didn't eat it. Rabbi Yonasan Abishat says Mazber Toys the shade ate it. Now this completely changes the whole Purim story. I mean, she had some kind of twin shade that she was able to send in and do her bidding. So, like, how does this affect anything we learned here? First of all, what does Tosis mean? What does the Gemara mean? She got up out of the lap of Achashverosh and went to Mordechai. What'd she have to get up from Achashverosh for? She never went to him in the first place. B'chlal, on Daf Tezvav, Tezdayin. The Gemara says that B'chashar avadati, Daf Tezvav, B'chashar avadati, that she says to Mordechai, until now I was living with Achashverosh against my will, so it was ba'oines, so I'm not usher to you. But now that I go to him b'ratzain, now I'm usher to you. Why is she usher to Mordechai? Send the shade. Shady business, right? What? Shliach shel adam k'moisai. Ein shliach dvar avera. Right? Ein shliach dvar avera. Shliach shel adam k'moisai. Even though, I have a question. You know, I'm not in the mood of putting on tefillin. I'll send a guy to wear tefillin for me. Shlichus doesn't work on a mitzvah shebegufay. Shlichus doesn't work on avera shebegufay either. Right? So.
But he's saying that it's an avera.
What?
He's saying that it's an avera l'shma.
Very nice avera l'shma. She avera l'shma. You're still usher to your husband. Right. But not if it's not you. What if it's a shade?
Yeah, but then shade gets who's for the saving Jews, right? So that might be.
Yeah, but you can't.
It's a substitute.
What? Okay. But it doesn't ask her to her husband if she would send the shade, right? So why didn't she send the shade? Right? That's the question. Why she should have sent the shade. Why is she telling Mordechai, until now I was being nena, so I'm not usher to you, but now I have to go baratzain. You don't have to go baratzain. Send the shade. Send the shade. By the way, Reb Tzadok HaKohen writes in a very interesting sefer, not one of the typical storm that we know about, sefer Kuntras Arba Meir Shekel. Daryavesh was not the son of Mordechai. Daryavesh was not the son of Achashverosh. Daryavesh was the son of a shade. By the way, there's a famous story, a Halachik story about a woman in Hungary who she had a son. The husband said it wasn't from him, and she claimed it was from a shade. It's a famous tshuva about it. Famous tshuva about this.
Our religion about something.
Anyway,
Maybe Achashverosh, they will tell the difference between Esther and the shade, so Esther still has to go?
No. Like a robot. No. Could Achashverosh tell the difference? Apparently not, if she kept on sending the shade. In the Sefer Avodas Yisrael, and I looked for it last night, I have it Avodas Yisrael, the Kashnat Samagid. This is before Purim, Not Purim Torah, it's Torah. Kashnat Samagid says like this. But that argues on Tosfos. Look. Tosfos asks, how could she go from Achashverosh to Mordechai, but you need 3 months Havchana? So Tosfos says, no problem. She was Mishameshes B'moich. She used the contraceptive. That's against the Zohar. The Zohar says that she never lived with Achashverosh. It was a shade. Says Avodas Yisrael, the name of the shade was Moich. He had a name. His name was... When Tosfos says, Shehi Mishameshes B'moich, it means she was Mishameshes with a shade. His name was... Shalom Aleichem, what's your name? His name is Moich. That's how that Kashan Tzemagid said, Pshan Tosfos.
Actually, by Yosef at Tzaddik...
No, Yosef at Tzaddik was not involved in any of this business.
By Yosef at Tzaddik, it says that she grabbed his clothes.
Yeah.
And there's a message that says that he grabbed his clothes because when she grabbed him, all she grabbed was the clothes. He made himself a shade.
Really? Okay. I didn't know that. But Lamaisa, the Avodas Yisrael says there's no machlokes between the Zohar, the Arizal, and Tosfos. What happened? Something I said?
No. I'm sorry.
She's Meshameshes b'moich. That she was Meshameshes with a shade. His name was. Okay, listen to this. I happened to find last night in my house. I'm down to 4 boxes of Svarim that are now on the shelf. I'm almost there. There's a Sefer Divrei Torah. Divrei Torah. You know who wrote the Divrei Torah?
Chazal.
Who?
Chazal.
No. Reb Chaim Elazar Shapira. Who's that?
Munkatcher.
The Munkatcher. He says a davar nifla that he heard from his Zayda, the Rupshitzer. Unbelievable. The shaila is like this. If she had to send into shade, so why is she usher to her husband? What's the chashar avadati? Okay, he says like this. B'shem zekeni hakadosh. What?
A Sarah. No, that's why she's usher.
Don't live with her. Don't live with Achashverosh. Just send in the shade, and then.
But still a Sarah, so she's still usher to him, no? Because
Asher Avadati means that what she was saying was that if she lives with somebody while she's married, then she's usher to Mordechai forever, right?
No, not the Isra.
Right. He says he writes down B'Shem Zekeni Hakadosh Meirapshitz, the Zera Kodesh, on the pasuk, right? Mordechai tells Esther, Al tidami v'nafshech lihimalei beis hamelech mikol hayudim. What does that mean literally? Al tidami v'nafshech. Don't think you're going to escape the king's palace from all the Jews. Why? Kim hacharesh tacharishi. But as if you're quiet now. Revach v'hatzala. You're going to be Yamei laYehudim mimakom acher. Basically what he's telling her is, don't think if you're not going to risk your life, you'll be saved and we'll go down. We'll be saved and you'll go down. Listen to how the Zera Kodesh catches the pasuk. Ready for this? Why was Esther afraid to go to Achashverosh? Just like every other time she sent the shade and he never touched her, like the Zera Kodesh says, let her send in a shade this time. Says the Zera Kodesh. Mordechai was telling Esther like this. Al tidami v'nafshech. Could be read, don't copy your soul. Don't make a dimyon of your nefesh. Right? Maybe, Esther, you're going to want to make a shade again. A lashon of dimyon. Al tidami v'nafshech. Limali beis hamelech Yehudim. How? By sending in a dimyon, and this way she's going to be safe. Kiyem hacharesh tacharishi. A lashon of charshaya. In Shas, when we talk about kishuf, a lashon of charshaya, because if you start making these whispered incantations, kiyem hacharesh tacharishi ba'is hazois. You know what's going to happen? Revach v'hatzala yamay laYehudim mimakoy macher. Then we're going to have a hatzala, not from Koyach HaKedusha, we're going to have from the dark side. Ve'adu beis avich toivedu. And the Sefer Hasidim writes, somebody who used shadim, them and all their children and all their descendants are destroyed from the world. That's why Esther was afraid to send in the shade this time. Why? Because to save Klal Yisrael, al yedei shade, it would destroy her family. It says Mordechai, al tidami v'nafshech. Do not copy your soul. If you're going to use incantations at this time, Revach v'hatzala yamod la'Yehudim. You're going to be saved. But mimakoy macher v'yadu be'savich toivedu. And therefore you need to go yourself. So he wants to know, so then how did Esther send the shade every other time? It says like this, so let the miracle come, however the miracle needs to come. He says,
Achashverosh was calling her.
and says when if it's loy efshar, but if an acher, it's mutter. But if you don't need the shade, and you could get the salvation mitzad kedusha, you need to do that. Therefore, Mordechai told Esther, do not use the shade at this time. In other words, every other time when she needed to live with him, there was no alternative to avoid the Isser than to send the shade. But at this time, when she had to go present herself, this was the only way to do it.
Wasn't she presenting herself with Haman there as well?
Well,
when she was asking for...
This time, she invited Achashverosh and Haman to come back later in the day to a party. And then at the party, she said, come back tomorrow. And then the next day, she begged for her life.
So this isn't referring to the time when Haman was there?
This is referring to the time when she went into the king uncalled for. Without Haman. Without Haman.
You could say the Gemara always talks about the fact that Esther had a lot of chen, and that was her attribute. And in this circumstance, that's when she needed to use her particular attribute of chen to be able to have the party and start into motion these chain of events that a shade couldn't replicate.
So you're saying the shade cannot replicate the chen. I don't know. The truth is, I can't tell you exactly how charming shadim are. Right? I don't know.
Demonology, actually.
It doesn't answer why she said she went to Ross then. If she always sent the shade, then...
True. I'm not done yet. Okay? I'm just pointing out a completely different reading of the pasuk. Kiyem hacharish tacharish beis hazois revach v'atzal yam la'yim makamacher. Comes back Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. He wants to know if every night Esther sent the shade, then Rashi says that the reason why she was toivel is because it would be disgusting to Mordechai to live with her after Achashverosh did. But she never lived with Achashverosh. She sent in a shade. Achashverosh says that's exactly why Mordechai insisted she go to the mikvah. Why? Says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, if every time Esther went to Achashverosh, she was a shade, mehechi teisi, that when she was coming to Mordechai, it was her, maybe it was also a shade. But the Gemara says there's only one antidote to shade him. Water. So therefore Mordechai insisted she's toivel. She's toivel, it must be her. And then he lived with her. But he needed the mikvah it was like an identity check. What? Authenticate. Usually we don't, this is just special before Purim. We don't always... Okay, I'm not done. So comes the Ben Yehoyada. Ben Yehoyada says like this. This is an unbelievable Ben Yehoyada. Actually, two Ben Yehoyadas. I gotta find it. There are two Ben Yehoyadas. Actually, there are three Ben Yehoyadas that talk about it. We're going to talk about two. So again, the Zohar, the Arizal, they say that Esther never lived with Achashverosh be'oines al yedei the shade. Al yedei, right? Esther never lived with Achashverosh directly. She always sent the shade. So the Ben Ish Chai says you should know that when you're dealing with the Shemois and Shadim, it's not like something you could just do. It has to be mamish, no alternative, because it's very dangerous to play around with these things. So he says that in the beginning, in other words, he wants to know why did Mordechai insist she was toivel if, after all, Esther never lived with Achashverosh. He lived with the shade. He says like this: Esther had to go in. And Esther had to do everything except for the Maisa Atzma. Because you can't just use Shemais to save you from the preliminary part. That doesn't warrant using the Shemais. So she had to go in there and do everything until the Maisa, and then when the Maisa came, she used the shade. So that's why Mordechai didn't want to look at her until she went to the mikvah, because even though she didn't do Oisai Maisa with Achashverosh, but the preliminary she did. Says the Ben Yehoyada, You have to be medayek carefully. I'm not sure if we're going to put this one up. You have to be medayek carefully. The lashon of the Gemara, she was oimedes mechek Achashverosh v'yosheves bechek Mordechai. I mean, like the Gemara's mashma, she only went to Mordechai, jumping out of Achashverosh to Mordechai. Why couldn't she go like a different day or a different time? Or a different month. No. It sounds like the only time she lived with Mordechai was jumping out of Achashverosh into Mordechai. What's up with that? It says like this. How did she, we asked, are you kidding me? She snuck into Shushan to the Jewish quarter. Imagine the queen. Imagine the queen sneaking into Borough Park. Nobody's going to know about it? I mean, give me a break. She's gonna knock on Mordechai, the Gadol Hador. Imagine the Gadol Hador today. You think, how did she get into the Jewish quarter, knock on the Gadol Hador's house, get in there, and nobody knew about it? It wasn't on the Yated, it wasn't front page Yated, middle section Yated. How did she pull it off? Teretz is, she had to use the shame. The shame allowed her to be invisible. Yeah? So don't go. Who asked her to make a nest and a miracle to make herself invisible and go live with Mordechai? It's so critical to go live with him. She would just use a shame for her own pleasure to go to Mordechai? The answer is like this. She would never be able to go to Mordechai. To use a shame to go to Mordechai just for her own pleasure? But while she was using the shame to get out of Achashverosh, which that was critical, because she didn't want to be over Gilui Arayos, so once she was at it, in other words, she would never use the shame just to go to Mordechai. But anyway, she needed to use the shame to get out of Achashverosh's grasp. When she saw that Achashverosh wanted her, then she needed to use the shame. So that's the moment she sent the shade. And at that moment, while she was using the shame, she was able to make herself invisible and go to Mordechai at the same time. Otherwise, she never would have been able to do such a thing, because that would have been just using a shame for her own pleasure. But now that it was critical that she did it to save herself, she was allowed to do it. Now, you'll say, so don't. Just make a shade to go to Achashverosh. What does she need? Who says you could abuse the shame? Who says there's like a once you're at it, Svara? Right? We're saying there's a whole v'ishtari, like the Gemara says in Yavamas. But the Ben Ish Chai is saying that she would never be able to go to Mordechai Stamazai. She'd only be able to go to Mordechai when she's in the grasp of Achashverosh, and that was critical to avoid. Then she go to Mordechai. So then just use the shame to get out of Achashverosh's grasp and go home. Or the answer is what?
A shade has a certain shelf life.
Yeah.
If it's not being used, it could end up being destructive. Therefore, she had to occupy the shade's time for as long as it existed. Therefore, she used it for good by going to Mordechai. But there's a lot of assumptions that go with this comment. But who knows? One second. Who knows otherwise?
The shade was living with Achashverosh,
and it finished.
But meanwhile, she's using the same shame to make herself disappear and go to Mordechai. Why did she have to do that?
Because the shade that was used by Achashverosh was done, and she went back to Esther and asked for further instructions.
But what does that have to do with her going to Mordechai?
It's not like a monk who has one job at a time.
Okay, it could be right.
I have no idea.
So he says like this. He says, we'll talk later how you know this. But he says like this. It was critical. Because if Achashverosh is living with the shade, and he looks up for a second, and there's another Esther and then sitting on the chair, he's going to be scratching his head. Oh, there are two of them? So she needed to get out of there. It was just that, like it was critical to get out of the clutches of Achashverosh. It was critical to get out of there, Bechlal.
She has to go to Mordechai.
To Mordechai, she could have made herself visible in the palace.
So,
why she have to go to him? She could have just.
He wasn't too bright.
Really taking it.
The answer is she needed to make herself invisible. So that she took advantage of. To that extent she took advantage of. In other words, she didn't use it. She wouldn't use it stam to go to Mordechai. But since she needed to use it to avoid Achashverosh's suspicion that there's another one in the room, she took advantage of that. That's why the Gemara says she could only take advantage of it when the shade was b'cheiko shel Achashverosh. She was able to go l'cheiko shel Mordechai.
But I think from the lesson of the Gemara that it was.
And he says it could be how did she get out of Mordechai's house? I mean, how did she avoid visibility going back from Mordechai to the palace?
Mordechai was in Shushan Abira. Just like the other share.
Still,
he was near the palace anyway.
He was nearby, but Lamaisi she had to extend the invisibility aura for a little bit more.
Teleportation either on that way.
She went from the Chek of Achashverosh to Mordechai, to the Chek of Mordechai.
Right.
Which would seem that it was the same. If it was a demon, it was a shade. It was a shade. If it was Esther, it was Esther. It was one.
You're saying it was the same person.
That's what it seems.
I hear it. The Ben Ish Chai feels that that according to the Zohar, you have to read the Gemara that way, right? The Vilna Gaon has a klal that the Zohar never contradicts the Gemara. Rabbi say 2 more steps. There's another Ben Ish Chai. What? Usually it's a lamda shashira, but
very lamda.
Is there anything wrong with just learning the Pashup shot of the Gemara?
Yeah, what?
Whatever.
There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just telling you. There's a Zohar, there's an Arizal that says that there's another dimension here that you have to deal with. In fact, Reb Tzadok HaKohen says Daryavish was the son of this shade.
And Achashverosh.
Achashverosh and the shade. Okay.
Yeah, but then it means that the building of the Beis Hamikdash came from the other side.
Okay. He didn't build it. He authorized it.
He gave money.
A lot of shadim give money. A lot of money. I don't know.
Shady money.
Yeah, okay. Rabbi, so let me tell you one more thing. So the kasha is, what about the chasher avadati? Why does Esther say, until now it's ba'inus, but now it's baratzin, I'm going to come usher to you, so just send in the shade. Listen to this. It comes down to an unbelievable thing. Lamaisa, halacha does not follow the mystical aspect. It looked like Esther was living with Achashverosh. And if she makes a shade, and a lookalike shade, and the shade lives with Achashverosh, halachically, Esther is now Esther to Mordechai. Because halacha does not, ein ladayin elamash ein avrayas. If Bezdin would have, right, if there would be 2 Eidim, and they would see this Maisa, they would answer it. Esther comes, it's a shade. Shkoyach, it's a shade, right.
Is that because she's not believed to say it's a shade? What if there's proof that it actually was a shade?
He says the following lashon: Kivan de begiloi hi hoyleches meritzayna. Nasara somewhere. In other words, she went. She did go. When she was there, she used the shade. That, if another woman would do that, she would be also to her husband. So now, what are we going to do? You're saying, is it because we don't believe her? It sounds like no. Even we believe her, but nothing we could do. Halacha follows what's begiloi, not what's benistar. I mean, right, there's a klal, in other words, let's say you drink oranges, but there are bugs in it. You can't see them. You can't see them. If you can't see it, it's not usher. Even you can look in a microscope, doesn't matter. So a makubal could see a shade living with Achashverosh, doesn't matter. Begiloi looks like Esther is living with Achashverosh. Lamaisa, Ben Yehoyada gives another answer, and according to this, the whole story spins. Inami, listen to this. She thought like this. What was her plan? What was Esther's plan? Esther thought she's going to go into the king and say, "King, save the people." She thought that she would do it b'shas ma'isa, right? She didn't think she's going to go in. He's going to stick out the stick, and she's going to say, "Could you save our people?" She figured she'll utilize the right time. Okay. So she figures she's going to go in, prepare him, butter him up, and at that moment, she's going to ask him. But if she sends a shade, the shade apparently cannot take care of the request. Maybe could shade him talk? I don't know. No?
Not for public consumption.
What?
Very good.
I don't know.
That was a male shade.
You can't leave once you...
Woman shades
As you're walking out, leave us.
So she thought she's going to have to go in and remain herself to make the request. Aber Lamaisa, Hashgacha had it. According to the Ben Yehoyada, she never made the request at the time she thought. She made the request at the party. Turns out, she never lived with him, Baratzain. Turns out, according to the second answer of the Ben Yehoyada, Shitaka was not usher to Mordechai. So it comes out, according to the big nafkamina between the two answers of Ben Yoyada. According to the first answer, that look, you have a look-alike and it wasn't you, halacha doesn't go that way, you're usher to Mordechai. According to the second answer of Ben Yoyada, the chashara of adati was what she thought, but it wasn't the reality. Lamaisa, she never was usher to Mordechai.
Well, the shot is that he put out the Shabbat Azav and nothing happened?
No, the Shabbat Azav, and she said, come to the party tomorrow.
That was the end of the interaction.
That was the end of it. Okay. So we gotta end off with a little lumdus over here. Okay, Tosfos says on Tosfos Kashar Avadati, Tosfos says like this. Frek Tosfos, why was she worried that she become also to Mordechai? Why doesn't Mordechai just give her a get? Mamela, when she's living with Achashverosh, she's not a married woman. Let Mordechai just divorce her. Yeah? So Tosfos says that in order to give a get, you need Eidim. And if you need Eidim, she was afraid, and Mordechai was afraid that Yisparsim Hadavar Lamalchus, and therefore what? She didn't. They cannot give her a get. Mordechai cannot give her a get because then Nisparsim Hadavar that she was going back to Mordechai. The Rashba says, what do you need Eidim for a get? Right? The Shita of the Rashba is you could give Ksav Yadai. If the husband himself writes the get, you don't need Eidos on the get. You don't need Eidos on the get. Why do you need Eidos on the get? I'll tell you halacha l'maisa. The halacha is, the Gemara says, you can't lend money to somebody without witnesses. You know this halacha? You can't lend someone. Someone says, can I borrow $100? It's a mitzvah to say dairaisa, but if you lend money without witnesses, you're over alav in the Torah l'fnei iver lo'sitei mashal, right? Because the person could come to deny it. You have to, however, Chavetz Chaim paskins in the Avas Chesed. Ksav Yadai, if the person himself writes an IOU, that's tantamount to witnesses. So in other words, if he writes, I, Pliny ben Pliny, Pliny ben Pliny, $100, you don't need Edom, that has the effect, he's not going to deny that, okay? So the Rashba says, why does Tosfos say you need Edom for a get? Just get Ksav Yadai. Let Mordechai in his own handwriting write the get, and then you don't need Eidos. That's the Shita of the Rashba. So, do you remember from your yeshiva days? Tosfos in Gittin says, who do we paskin like? Edei Chasima Karti or Edei Masira Karti? Right? What makes a get? What causes a get to be chal? It's machlokes, right? Blazer and Rameir. Rabbi Blazer says, what? Edei Chasima Karti. That the Edom that signed the get, that makes a get. So according to that, we understand. According to that, you could use Ksav Yadai, because Ksav Yadai is tantamount to the Edei Chasima. But Tosfos paskins that Edei Masira Karti. Edei Masira Karti means what creates the get, not the Edom that sign it, the Edom that watch it being delivered, watch it being given over. So Tosfos l'shitase. Tosfos says that you need Kol Maseh Haget Al Pi Edim. It's not just the signatures; it's they witness it being given over. Lamaisa Tosfos in Gittin says on Daf Yud Zayin that even the man Omar Edei Chasima Karti also holds you need Edim. Why? Because Ein Davar Shaver B'Chas Mishnayim. The Raja doesn't agree to that. But Tosfos' Shita is that even if you hold Edei Chasima Karti, you would need Eidos. Mamela, Mordechai was afraid to give Esther a get. Whether you hold Edei Masira Karti, certainly, and even if you hold Edei Chasima Karti, you need Eidos for Ein Davar Shebe'erva Pachos Mishnayim. Rabbi say, what goes on in Kehilas Abbas Yisrael stays in Kehilas Abbas Yisrael. Okay. Oops.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.